What is the biggest concern for the Minnesota Vikings as they enter training camp with the preseason and regular season right around the corner? Well, I have a report from one of the insiders from the Minnesota Vikings that reveals just that, and I'm going to explain why I disagree with that wholeheartedly. This take is presented by Hochland Farm. Contact Hochland Farm at 952-491-1541 for the best rotationally grazed 100% grass-fed beef. This beef is sold in quarters and halves, and Hochland Farm has custom sample packs so you can try before you buy in bulk. Thank you, Hochland Farm. Thank you, listeners. Because of this deal from Hochland Farm, you get 20% off your first order by mentioning the Minnesota Tim podcast. So if you want to get great beef in your freezers today, all you have to do is contact Hochland Farm at 952-491-1541, mention the Minnesota Tim podcast, and immediately get a 20% off your first order. Unbelievable. Contact them today, 952-491-1541. Okay, so Alec Lewis is an insider from The Athletic, and he has been covering the Minnesota Vikings for a few years now. And a couple weeks ago, I don't know, I'm pretty terrible with time frame of things, like 3 years ago was 9/11. It was like 24 years ago, something like that. Anyway, 23 years ago, 2001, right? Anyways, I disagreed with a report that he had last week, I think it was. I said that J.J. McCarthy is being coddled by the media because he went on to share this report, and I highly respect Alec Lewis and his writing. He's a great writer. I read his stuff daily. And he was basically saying that, J.J. McCarthy is struggling because he's throwing to new wide receivers. He's got a new system, new playbook. And it's like, okay, which rookie quarterback isn't going through those things? Which veteran quarterback isn't going through those things when a head coach gets fired, new receivers come in, new receivers leave, whatever? Quarterbacks go through that process every single offseason. So I don't really necessarily think it's any different for J.J. McCarthy. It's just taking him a little bit longer because he's raw. Well, he came out with a different report recently, and he explores the biggest concern heading into training camp on the Minnesota Vikings. And the biggest concern for him is, who is the team's number 3 wide receiver? He goes on to say, is it Brandon Powell? Can Jalen Naylor stay healthy enough to play the role? If it's not those two guys, then who? This roster hole surfaced once KJ Osborne signed with the Patriots in free agency. The Viking staff loves Powell, which is understandable. He is reliable, tough, and shifty, but he is also a 5'8", 181-pounder, and the team's punt and kick returner. If he's wide receiver 3, who will return kicks? Trent Sherfield is another option, but he didn't blow the staff away in OTAs. There are some free agent options like Hunter Renfrow, but Renfrow isn't much of a blocker. Does Coach Kevin O'Connell want a receiver who can help in the run game? If so, that might be hard to find at this point. So I want to break down just this paragraph where Alec Lewis discusses the wide receiver 3 position. My first thought, Jalen Naylor, he is close to joining the legends on the Minnesota Vikings roster, like Greg Childs. Does anyone remember who Greg Childs was? I remember Greg Childs. He was one of my favorite all-time college receivers, and the Minnesota Vikings got their hands on him, and he was explosive in training camp, but then he got hurt. Then he came back again, and then he got hurt again. He was the greatest myth in Minnesota Vikings history because there was so much talent there, and every single Minnesota Vikings fan supported Greg Childs and got behind Greg Childs and called him the next superstar. but he kept on getting hurt. He never saw the football field in a regular season game, or at least I don't think he had, because he was always hurt. Tore a ligament here, tore a ligament there. It's really a sad story because he was a tremendously talented player, but he's a legendary player in Minnesota Vikings history because of what I just said. Jalen Nailor, he's close to joining that list because even though he's played a few more snaps in the regular season than Greg Childs did, all we hear about from Jalen Nailor is how talented of a wide receiver he is, how he's able to get separation from cornerbacks, how he's able to get separation from safeties, how he has explosiveness at the wide receiver position, how he could easily fill in the role of wide receiver 3. Yet he's got a sickness here, yet he's hurt there, yet he misses mandatory OTAs here, yet he misses almost the entire season last year because of this, because of that. He is never on the football field because he's always hurt. And I believe that he's got this tremendous talent, just like Greg Childs did. But you got to be on the football field, man. You got to get your butt on the sidelines and into the end zone. You got to get your butt onto the field and run these routes and block these cornerbacks for the running game to show just how valuable that you are. I almost quoted, was it Waterboy? Get your butt in the end zone. No, it's longest yard. Get your butt in the end zone. We need to win this thing. Anyway, so Brandon Powell. It says he's a 5'8", 181-pounder. He was impressive to me last year. Caught the game-winning touchdown versus the Atlanta Falcons. I think he's like the perfect slot guy as a wide receiver 3 position. I mean, players have made careers out of that, like Julian Edelman, Wes Welker. I don't think Brandon Powell's too short. I think it's perfect to have an underneath guy like Brandon Powell to complement the explosive downfield threats of Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. It says that he's also the team's punt and kick returner. Well, you can easily replace those things. What happened to, maybe we don't have Nwangu anymore, but you can easily find another kick returner. And if he's the punt returner, big deal. How many times do players actually return punts in the NFL? I'd say 80% of the time it's a fair catch, or it's punted into the end zone, or it's punted and they try to get the ball kneeled down at like the 1 or 2 yard line or whatever. I don't think there's actually that many punt returns in the NFL. And if there are punt returns in the NFL, how many of them go for more than 10 to 15 yards? So why can't he be a slot wide receiver? Take a down off. Take first down off if you need to take a down off. I don't think that's necessarily a reliable excuse for the Minnesota Vikings to not trust Brandon Powell at that wide receiver 3 position. Now, I still think the problem with this report is that the biggest concern for the Vikings heading into training camp isn't who is wide receiver 3. My biggest concern is, can they find quarterbacks that can guard the opposing wide receivers? Because we saw that over and over and over again last year, where Minnesota Vikings cornerbacks just got annihilated on the football field by elite wide receivers and by subpar average quarterbacks like Jake Browning. Jake Browning had a field day against the Minnesota Vikings because he just launched up balls to Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, and they just went up and got the ball because the Minnesota Vikings cornerbacks were incapable. I think the biggest concern is, will Shaq Griffin's presence on the Minnesota Vikings defense have an immediate impact that will be felt by the whole defense? Because you can have great pass rushers, and obviously those guys affect the game greatly. They brought in Greenard. We don't know if Van Winkle's going to be healthy. That's a concern. But you brought in the good linebacker. But can they guard? Can Evans and Blackman, can Griffin, can the first 2 guys that I mentioned take the next step? Can Andrew Booth Jr. make the roster after training camp? Because the latest report is he's not going to. So who's going to guard? My second biggest concern isn't even the wide receiver position. It's the interior of the offensive line. Is Ed Ingram going to take another step, or is he just going to stay the same? Will Garrett Bradbury play similar to the way he did last year? But he's undersized. Bigger defensive tackles just completely cream him. And then the Blake Brandel or Dalton Reisner. Dalton Reisner, I thought he played sensationally last year. Gave up 0 sacks. But Blake Brandel, he's never been a consistent starter on the offensive line. And the Minnesota Vikings just paid him multiple millions of dollars. I think $3.75 million, something along those lines, to be the likely starting guard on the offensive line. How is that not a bigger concern than Brandon Powell being wide receiver 3? I don't even think it's close. You can find wide receiver 3s around the league by signing a Hunter Renfrow or trusting Brandon Powell, or maybe Jalen Naylor's healthy for the first time in his career. But I would say cornerback and offensive line, even quarterback, my goodness, Sam Darnold bounced around the league. Can he actually prove what we all hope he can be? And that's an efficient and effective quarterback and a good leader mentor for J.J. McCarthy. I don't think wide receiver position is anywhere close to being the biggest concern for the Minnesota Vikings. There are question marks all over this roster. And if the quarterback or offensive line, if those positions fail, well, then the Minnesota Vikings season has a great chance of failing, because you need those positions in the NFL to be good, at least good, if not great. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you're watching, hit that subscribe button right there. If you're listening, please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you are listening to this podcast. Everyone, thank you for making this episode a part of your day.